Now, the history of music is strewn with what we like to call characters, and as characters go, there's no doubt that Percy Grainger was made of solid gold. Unfortunately, it's to his detriment that that's the only picture most people have of him, and it's unfortunate because he was also a shining 24-carat genius, with all the craggy edges and inner turbulence that naturally go with genius. I can recall the exact day and circumstances in 1966 when it came to me as a sort of road to Damascus-like inspiration that I must do something about this fellow Grainger. I'd always loved the music of Grieg, and Delius was by then creeping into the firmament of my musical heroes, when one day I picked up in a junk shop one record only of a set of Grainger playing the last movement of the Chopin B minor sonata. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and I was never quite the same person after. It was as if a rattling and defiant express train, steam of course, had just dashed through my room, and it left me speechless and physically knocked about for hours. Well, that's how I found the seeds of my obsession and my quest. I said to myself, there must be an extraordinary man behind those miraculous sounds, and I felt that somehow he was speaking directly to me, so I decided to look further. Later came my love affair with his music and the subsequent years I spent in Australia researching his life. Grainger once wrote, "Nothing of the sounds, nothing of the happenings of life should be forgotten. Of all bad habits, the worst, it seems to me, is to let resplendent things fade away." Now hold on to that, because it's a key to so much in Percy's life and work. I'd like to begin by giving you the briefest of biographical sketches, and in doing so I'll just point out one thing, and that is that I'll be speaking to you as a music lover and one of his biographers, and not as a musician. The distinction may seem trivial, to me it's important. But in giving this talk, I've no other motive than a wish to extend to you an invitation to share in my joy of this man's life and work. George Percy Grainger was his real name, and he was born in Brighton, just outside Melbourne, in the state of Victoria, Australia, on July the 8th, 1882. And wherever he went, whatever he did, his spiritual roots lay deeply locked in Australian soil. His father, John Harry Grainger, was a tall, dark-haired Englishman who was born in 1855 on a train just as it was drawing into a London railway station. He went to Australia in 1877, from which time he held posts as architect and engineer to various state governments there. Now this was his great talent. His great shortcomings, however, were the demon drink, a vile temper, and wild women, though in his sober moments he's remembered as having been a kindly and thoughtful man. Percy's mother, Rosa, or Rose Annie Aldridge, was a first-generation Australian, born in Adelaide in 1861. Not long after Percy was born, Rose discovered that she'd caught syphilis from John Grainger. In those days, it was incurable and slow and lethal. And when she moved to a separate bedroom, his binges, which would last several days, became more frequent and violent, and she found that the only way she could defend herself from his advances was with the horsewhip. The young and impressionable Percy was to witness many of these fearful scenes, and his parents eventually separated when he was 8. From a biographer's point of view, I wanted to find an event in my subject's childhood to latch on to as being symbolic, as it were, of the whole life. The film buffs amongst you will understand what I mean when I say that I was looking for something which played the part in Grainger's life as Rosebud did in Citizen Kane's. Anyway, I think I found one in the story of how his mother and father gave him a plot of land in the back garden, with all the tools and the seeds to begin a tiny flower and vegetable garden. And what did our Percy do? Well, He cast all the seeds aside, and instead he went out into the country, and he collected wildflowers, and flowers which any self-respecting horticulturalist would have called weeds, and he planted and nurtured them there with as much loving care as if they'd been serried ranks of prize-winning roses. What little we know about Rose comes mainly through the writings of Percy, and we're told that as a child, as well as being very musical, she was also a tomboy, fond of horse riding, tree climbing, and so on. Her nickname, by the way, was Carrots because of her red hair. Now, I really wish we knew more about her, because it might tell us more about Percy, and this extraordinary mother-son relationship, made ever closer by shared, dark secrets. This was the pivotal key of the whole story. Percy's formal education lasted no more than 3 months, and took place at the Mrs. Turner's Preparatory School for Boys in Caroline Street, South Yarra. Rose had already, of course, recognised her son's natural curiosity and prodigious talents. Perhaps she'd determined them in part, and she, like Percy after her, believed that education, like food, should be a provision to satisfy a hunger initiated by the student, and that if it came from outside like force-feeding, it would be useless. I use the expression perhaps determined her son's talents because, you know, there's this singular story of how, when she was carrying her as yet unborn child, she'd spend hours on her bed gazing at a reproduction statue of a Greek god, hoping that this would endow her child with similar godlike qualities. At home, Rose taught him history, English literature, and arithmetic, which he always had the greatest difficulty in mastering. You know, he could never count his change in a restaurant. She also directed his attention towards the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Freeman's history of the Norman conquest, and, most important, the Icelandic sagas. This obviously affected him profoundly, so that in adulthood he could write, "The saga of Grettir the Strong immediately became, and has always remained, the strongest single artistic influence in my life, providing me with an ideal example of what Nordic art should be, shapely yet formless, many-sided yet monotonous, rambling, multitudinous, drastic, tragic, stoical, ruthlessly truth-proclaiming." Out of the Freeman book, the Battle of Hastings had become, and it still is, an acute personal tragedy. My duty as a composer seemed clear, to turn back in my music the tide of the Hastings battle, by celebrating all seemingly Old English, Anglo-Saxon and Norse characteristics, by ignoring, as far as possible, all seemingly Norman traits and influences, and those derived from the civilization of the Roman Empire. That is why I've called my quartets foursomes, why I've coined Loudon and middle fiddle to replace crescendo and viola, and why I've refused to write any form bearing Southern European titles such as sonata, symphony, and concerto. Piano lessons from his mother from the age of 5 were extended when at 10 he was sent to study harmony and piano for a year with Louis Pabst, a former pupil of the redoubtable Anton Rubinstein, one of the few pianists of the late 19th century whose name was ever mentioned in the same breath as that of Liszt. He made his debut on July the 9th, 1894 at Melbourne's Masonic Hall, and the proceeds from a benefit concert given a year later enabled Rose to take her son to Frankfurt am Main in Germany, where he enrolled in the piano classes of James Kvast and the harmony and counterpoint classes of Ivan Knorr at Dr. Hoch's conservatorium. His studies with Knorr were quickly terminated. In short, they loathed each other, and thereafter he took lessons outside the conservatorium with one Karl Klimsch, a retired lithographer and amateur musician, and a man whom Grainger feared, loved, and worshipped. According to Grainger, Klimsch's theory of composition was this: if you have no theme or melody in your head, don't compose at all. If you have a theme or melody, start off with it right away, and the moment your melodic inspiration runs out, stop your piece. No prelude, no interlude, no postlude, just the pith of the music all the time. I dare say that's the philosophy with which the Austrian composer Anton von Webern might have wholly concurred, though how the other Austrian Anton would have reacted I dread to think. His work at the Conservatorium brought him in touch with 5 other boys: Cyril Scott, Balfour Gardner, Norman O'Neill, Roger Quilter, and the Dane Herman Sandby, all of whom influenced each other and remained lifelong friends. Around the age of 15-16, he began to compose with an assured mastery and bold inventiveness remarkable for his age, occasionally using irregular rhythms and attempts at a whole-tone scale. By the age of 18, he was using time signatures and time signature changes which would have made Stravinsky's hair curl had he known. When Rose Grainger's earning power, now she'd been teaching English in Germany, when this was halted in 1900 as the result of illness, Percy began giving piano lessons and recitals and accompanying singers in and around Frankfurt. The years when he was free to compose without the imperative of having to earn a living had been few, but they were over forever. In 1901, he and his mother moved to London, and he quickly established himself as one of the most sought-after concert pianists and recitalists of the day. Before the Great War, he'd toured Scandinavia, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Germany, Russia even, Holland, Switzerland, Bohemia, and of course the British Isles. Walking from concert to concert whilst on tour, and making his own clothing from toweling material, were just 2 expressions of his fierce athleticism and rugged individuality. He was a strikingly handsome young man, and this made him a great favourite as a society pianist, and this was his biggest source of income during those early London years. Whenever he entered a room, women tended to fall about in heaps, and that was women of both sexes. And his letters and autobiographical writings from this period and relating to this period reveal a love life which knew the bounds of neither Christian guilt nor orthodoxy. He allowed, in fact he wanted, his mother personally to manage both his public musical life and his private love affairs. It was she who decided whether a girl was suitable, and it was she who decided on the nature and duration of his love affairs. Any independence of action he took in this area was obtained by stealth or cunning, and was strongly resented by Mum if discovered. The London-based years also saw his piano studies with Ferruccio Busoni, his brief but important friendship with Grieg, his most intense folk song collecting activities, the beginning of his devoted friendship with Delius, the start of his career as a recording artist, the continuation of his most fruitful compositional period begun in Frankfurt, and the publication and first performances of his compositions. Grainger collected and made cylinders of nearly 500 British folk songs. He hiked and cycled through Lincolnshire, Gloucestershire and Worcestershire to make his indelible mark as a major folk song collector by pioneering in Britain the use of the phonograph and transcribing the material he collected with a previously unknown scrupulous attention to the detail of the folk singer's art. The folk song establishment greeted his collection and his findings in the traditional British fashion, with galloping inertia, and with monumental and indeed for Percy hurtful indifference, and after about 1909 he did hardly any more collecting in Britain. His had been a voice crying in a British wilderness, though he did do some field recordings in New Zealand amongst the Maoris, and later in Jutland, Denmark. In 1914 the Graingers did what we call a bunk and came to America, where eventually they settled in White Plains just outside New York. Here he continued his successful concert career, yet he was never able to free himself from the dilemma of wanting to give more or all of his time to composing, but only being able to do this by his earnings from his activities as a touring virtuoso, which of course took all his time and energies, and in which he found himself inextricably enmeshed. It was like a dog forever chasing its own tail. In 1917 he joined the 15th Band of the Coast Artillery Corps as bandsman second class, playing oboe, bassoon, bass clarinet and saxophone, and eventually he gained the rank of band instructor. For a while he enjoyed a degree of anonymity not known since his youth in Frankfurt, and this enabled him to perfect his skills in scoring for wind and brass combinations. But before long he was discovered, as it were, hiding amongst the ranks of the 15th Band of the Coast Artillery Corps, and he was asked to perform arduous touring duties for Red Cross war charities, which of course he did uncomplainingly. On June the 3rd, 1918, he adopted US citizenship. At the end of hostilities, he resumed his concert career, but this was interrupted by his mother, who in 1922, at the climax of ill health and personal problems, took her own life. Her relentless domination over him was to persist beyond the grave, and about 20 years later we find him writing, and this is quite typical, I might add, "I was convinced that my mother's entire happiness in life was rooted in her possessing me tooth and nail entirely to herself." And in old age even, we note this entry in his diary: June the 3rd, beloved mother would have been 95 today. I have felt the tragic influence of her death more in this year, 1957, than in any other year. In 1926 he met a beautiful Swedish poet and artist, Viola Ström, on a ship taking them from Australia to America's west coast. She was a woman of grace, dignity and strength, and 2 years later they were wed on the stage of Hollywood Bowl before a paying congregation of 20,000 after a concert of music composed and conducted by himself, with an orchestra of 126 musicians, the largest the Bowl had seen to that date, which I suppose was all a very good way of upstaging the parson. A marriage by turns stormy, though largely happy, ensued. During the year 1932-33, he accepted the only formal teaching post of his life, when he became head of the music department of New York University, numbering amongst his pupils in advanced composition Bernard Herrmann and Morton Gould. Now legend has it that some of his students treated him as a joke, and his classes were said to be not particularly well attended, except on one occasion, when he invited the entire Duke Ellington band to illustrate one of his lectures. On that occasion they broke down 2 doors to get in. This brief brush with academic institutions so disillusioned him, however, that subsequently he flatly turned down not only further offers of prestigious academic posts, but also a number of honorary doctorates of music, saying that as his music was hostile to the idea of education, and as it was the product of non-education, he believed that he was one to whom educational honours could not apply. And besides which, he said, academic distinctions were undemocratic. He despised people who volunteered to live in ivory towers of any kind, their hands unsullied by life beyond their hermetically sealed class. In the late 1930s, much of his time and energy was given over to building and stocking his museum in Melbourne. Now, it would probably take me several hours even to attempt to give reasons why he built this most extraordinary of museums, but I'll try to put it in a nutshell. Of course, I suppose one could be excused for thinking at first glance that this enormous product of one man's endeavour was a monument to his vanity, but one would be wrong. First of all, it was the repayment of a debt to a city which had enabled him as a lad to travel the world, learn his trade, and broaden his experience. But why a Grainger Museum, more than half filled with the most incredible and indescribable collection of what might be thought of as being nothing more than personal junk? Everything from rare musical instruments to laundry bills, a priceless collection of art, manuscripts and correspondence, his old clothes, his doctor's prescriptions. Now why fill it with this heap of stuff, which would have made any magpie envious? Why not build a small concert hall, or endow a scholarship, or something useful like that? I think a key can be found in a letter he wrote to a friend in 1940. I do not know what you mean by self. I'm not aware of containing any self. I'm a complete enigma to myself, a riddle which I do not in the least wish to solve. My nature, my personality, does not interest me in the least. Now you remember that quotation I read in the early part of this talk about how he thought the worst habit was to forget and throw things away. Well, perhaps he was saying, now look, here I am, George Percy Grainger, composer, pianist, and eccentric, if you like. That's my name, rank, and number. But why I am that, I do not know, and I don't particularly care. But if you want to explore the reasons why any one man might have this gift, this mysterious alchemy, which can transmute experiences from the furthest shores of human joy and suffering into something different, something beautiful, pleasing, agonizing, something lasting, then here's your chance. You have your laboratory, your equipment, your material, all the physical manifestations of one man's life, and a remarkable man at that. I'm sure he would have added that. Go ahead. Do your worst. Well, that's precisely what I did, and what I'm sure others will do after me. He even left his skeleton to the museum, perhaps in the hope that here someone might find a link, an idea, a theory, a relationship, a key. The museum was opened with full ceremony on December the 10th, 1938, before 250 guests of civic and academic dignitaries. And when the museum had been formally handed over to the University of Melbourne, he promptly locked it up, and the public were never again admitted on a regular basis whilst he lived. Towards the end of his life, he began seeing much of his music going out of print, and what was worse, he would be informed by his publishers after the event that the printing blocks had been destroyed. In the 1940s and 1950s then, at a time in his life when he would have much rather have retired from the concert platform to devote himself to composition, he felt the need to adopt an urgent plan of action whereby he would travel thousands of miles by bus and train throughout Canada and America, asking only for his travel and overnight expenses, and offer to play the Grieg or the Tchaikovsky concertos free of charge, in exchange for which he would ask the conductor to program some of his less frequently performed pieces, simply to generate sales for his music and show his publishers that it was worth keeping in print. Grainger saw it as a matter of life and death. His concert career continued until a few months before his death, but as time passed he sought less the accolades of an internationally famous pianist and more a platform and sympathetic hearing for his compositional output. But of course, by then it was too late substantially to change the role his audiences had come to expect him to play. The last years of his life were spent largely in working towards a physical realization of his ideals for a free music, and in pursuit of this he developed, with the help of a scientist friend of his, Burnet Cross, a handful of wonderful mechanical and electronic instruments. Here he was aiming for the means to enable him to work with the freedom of nature's shapes and sounds, wave movements, wind howling through telegraph wires, undulating skylines and so on, remembered from his boyhood, and he wanted to speak directly to his audience without the arbitrary limitations of scale, pitch, meter, or the inhibiting intermediary of a performer. This generous, courageous, and somewhat tormented man died of cancer in White Plains Hospital on February the 20th, 1961. But what of Grainger the man and the musician? From the moment I began researching, I've regarded Grainger's life as that of a heroic tragedy. He was constantly complaining that the only pieces of his that people wanted to hear were his jolly pieces, and even these, he insisted, were energetic and fierce rather than jolly or fun-packed. Comedy in art, you know, is nothing more than a rechanneling of a private grief. Percy had been typecast as the court jester of music, and he hated it, because he believed that for every happy piece of his that people wanted to listen to, he'd written 20 more representative, melancholy pieces that his audiences were simply deaf to. He once wrote in no uncertain terms, "I think the entire musical world is entirely oblivious of the whole world of bitterness, resentment, iconoclasm, and denunciation that lies behind my music. If they were aware of it, I'm not so sure it would make any difference at all. And the worth of my music will never be guessed, or its value to mankind felt, until the approach to it is consciously undertaken as a pilgrimage to sorrows." Now think of that. Quite apart from his musical activities, he was a fine athlete, a teetotaler, vegetarian, a provocative essayist, and a brilliant, wholly self-taught linguist. He also had lots of bees in his bonnet about his native tongue. In brief, he wanted to use a form of English which had been purged, wherever possible, of words with Latin and Greek origins. The end result he called Nordic or Blue-Eyed English, and it wasn't by any means the totally cranky idea that it might at first appear to have been. His use of English dynamic and other instructions in his scores, of course, is all tied up with this. In nearly every case, it produces wonderfully descriptive phrases, perfectly conceived, which could rarely be expressed in Italian. Personally, I'd applaud any idea, however cranky, which might produce words and phrases such as explosive, with a drowsy lilt, skittishly, tellingly, bleatingly, waywardly, tenderly wild, top notes of woggle well to the fore, leisurely trudging, very simply and with a childlike unconscious pathos, and here it is, this is my favourite, begin primly and neatly, and bit by bit rouse up to a great and rowdy to-do. I wonder why it is that when Mahler, Schumann, and Beethoven even used German in their scores, we treat this with respect and even awe, but when Percy uses his native tongue, we tend to fall about in heaps of laughter. I'm also always especially delighted when I meet contemporary composers who, like Grieg, Delius, Fauré, Busoni, Richard Strauss, and Britten before them, express a genuine love of Grainger's music. And I was overjoyed recently when I met two Dutch avant-garde composers with unpronounceable names, who raved about Percy's music, and when I asked which pieces of his they liked best and why, they both replied, to my amazement actually, that they liked above all his colonial song, and they liked it because of its unashamed sentimentality. Some of you might recall that when Sir Thomas Beecham, whom Grainger sometimes referred to behind his back as that benighted British nincompoop, when he first heard colonial song, he said to Grainger that he'd succeeded in writing the worst piece of music of modern times. It was number one of a projected series of sentimentals, and Grainger, who was at that time abnormally oversensitive to criticism, didn't get round to publishing number 2, nor did he get round to writing number 3. Thank you, Sir Thomas. What can be said about Grainger the musician? Well, to begin with, the most abiding impression I have of his music is the joy I derive from seeing people, particularly musicologists, rushing around trying in vain to pin labels on him, and the thought that Percy himself all his life insisted on regarding himself as an amateur in the best sense, in the French sense, that is. I think Grainger, in fact, was one of the most unorthodox composers of the 20th century. He was a man apart, a man also somewhat larger than life, of total integrity, following no one's lights but his own. He was astonishingly prolific too, with a bewildering range. It's quite easy to take 2 or 3 works of Grainger, present them to someone unfamiliar with his music in a guess the composer sort of game, and get 3 different answers. In fact, it's not an easy task to get a broad view of Grainger's music. It's difficult to say exactly where it came from, what influences worked on him, how he developed, what aims he had, and how he may have influenced others, if at all. He sometimes talked about the influences on his boyhood of other composers such as Grieg, Brahms, Scriabin, Tchaikovsky, Schumann, Bach and Cyril Scott, though he rarely talked with any great conviction or enthusiasm except perhaps about Bach. One important influence, I think, was the fact that his mother used to sing lots of Stephen Foster to him as a boy. Although his upbringing was severely godless, in fact he remained a theological virgin all his life, one of his greatest joys as a boy was hanging around the local church of a Sunday, listening to the rich four-square hymns that came booming out. There's no doubt in my mind that one of the most important influences on Grainger was the fact that he was brought up in a home where reading aloud was a daily affair. That's almost a dead tradition, where I come from at least. The natural cadences and metre of poetry and spoken prose affected him enormously. Many of you, I'm sure, know the music of Leos Janáček. Well, the same thing affected Janáček as it did Grainger, the sound of the human voice. But coming back to this business of trying to get the broad view of Grainger's output, it is, I believe, almost impossible to look at his works as if you were sort of hanging items of clothing out on a washing line and say, oh, clearly it all started here, and that work has the early signs of what was to later develop into, and it all led up to this final quartet, or that Ninth Symphony. I'm afraid there's no Beethovenian progression there, at least not one that's immediately apparent. When I think of Grainger's journey through life as a composer, I'm forcefully reminded of the English poet William Blake, who in his Proverbs of Hell wrote, "Improvement makes straight roads, but the crooked roads without improvements are roads of genius." Having said that, however, I'm sure there is a link, in fact a multitude of links, some clear and others barely visible, between the various musical ports of call he made, and I'm sure it's futile to explore these links without tying them in some way to the non-musical events, ideas and circumstances of his life. After all, music or art of any kind, I believe, is most frequently the expression of a person's totality, not just one tiny area of the intellect. Grainger's been described by some as one of the most important contrapuntalists since the time of Bach, certainly one of the most important contrapuntalists of this century, and I think nothing bears witness to this claim better than some of his folk song settings, especially when he's writing in what seems to have been his favourite forms, the theme and variation, and especially the Passacaglia, where, as you know, the theme is constantly repeated without pauses and in the same key and at the same speed. Sometimes, when he's playing around with a tune, he'll bring in another folk tune, or a counter-melody of his own devising, sometimes in a different key or at a different rhythm, and just plonk the two or three or more even together. Percy hated the conventional symphony orchestra. He thought it was nothing more than a bad habit, a legacy of the 19th century that had outlasted its welcome, not only because he never wrote a symphony, but for many other positive reasons. He often produced several different versions of one work for different instrumental groupings. He believed that as long as the balance was correct, enabling the different voices to be heard, it didn't really matter whether he used 4 or 400 or 4,000 instruments. His friend Balfour Gardner used to chide him and say that this was simply because he couldn't make up his mind. Not so. Grainger knew perfectly well what he wanted, but he wasn't going to toe the line simply because of expediency or convention, so he devised what he called elastic scoring. "My music tells its story," Percy once wrote, "by means of intervals and the liveliness of the part writing, rather than by means of tone colour." Here's an example of a work Percy scored elastically. It's called Lord Peter's Stable Boy, a setting of a Danish folk song. By the way, Percy once got it put on in 1930 in the Chicago Civic Opera, I think, with a huge orchestra, including organ, bells, xylophone, wooden and metal marimbas, dulcitone, and 30 pianists at 19 pianos. If the ghost of Grainger were asked here today to take my place and talk about what he thought were his real musical achievements, I'm sure he'd rise gleefully to the challenge by saying that he'd spent most of his composing life amongst a vanguard of musicians who had been hacking away at the very coalface of the evolutionary process of music. He might proceed to catalogue the things which he'd pioneered, for which he felt he was still to be acknowledged, such as chance music, musical aleatory, the extensive use of tuneful percussion, advanced harmony, free music, irregular rhythms, beatless music, the choral use of wordless syllables, and so on, where his work had predated and in some cases shown the way for others. And the curious thing is that I have more than a sneaking suspicion that any laughter raised by such seemingly grandiose claims might well be wholly misplaced. He could well be right, but at present I frankly doubt that sufficient historical and analytical work has been done on his legacy to enable us yet to say for sure whether he was, as some would claim, merely indulging in the pathetic and desperate self-justification of an old and failed man, or whether in fact he was right and had failed only to inspire the respect and admiration of an ungrateful world. But with all respect to the memory of Grainger, I still think that though such a course of inquiry might be fascinating and indeed fruitful, it misses the main point, and this is a little sad, because I contend that his or anyone else's music will live on not mainly because he may or may not have been experimenting with musical aleatory before Cage, Berio and Stockhausen were born, not because he did or did not directly or indirectly influence Stravinsky and Schoenberg, but it will live, for me, simply on the strength of whether it can please, communicate and stimulate. And this will cut through and in the end triumph over all our silly concepts of precedence and what is in good taste or bad taste, what is fashionable, progressive, great or minor, light or serious, orthodox or unorthodox. For these redundant concepts are, in my view, nothing more than the mindless howlings of those insecure folk whose vested interests go to make up what's called a musical establishment, whoever, or whatever, or wherever they may be. Someone once asked Grainger what he thought of modern music and whether he didn't think the American composer Howard Hanson was a little old-fashioned. And he replied, "I love some modern composers, dislike others. I consider Howard Hanson a very wonderful composer. I cannot see that period matters in art. Art is not a matter of modern or old-fashioned. It's simply a matter of expressing individual feelings. If we like those feelings, good. If not, too bad." No doubt there's a multitude of very complicated reasons why the middle and later years of Grainger's life were clouded with more than a little bitterness. A bitterness, incidentally, which few of his friends can talk about, because Grainger usually confided it only to his distant correspondence and his extensive unpublished essays. To begin with, I'm sure he became partly a victim of fashion, living as he did through an age when the production of tuneful and approachable music was automatically considered by some to be highly suspect activity, devoid of any intellectual content whatsoever. We've all read in our musical history books and know how it took Mendelssohn to invent Bach, how Schumann invented Schubert, how Chopin didn't dare include the music of Scarlatti, which he loved so much in his programs, lest he was hissed off stage, and how no more than 4 or 5 pianists at the turn of the present century played Mozart piano concertos. Such were the dictates of fashion, I'm afraid, and people haven't really changed. Only hats and adjectives change. Grainger's not alone in this respect by any means, but his musical exile was a little different from most others, and it was perhaps first and best identified by the American bandmaster Richard Franco Goldman, when he suggested that Grainger's life forced us to reflect upon that obscurity created by the wrong kind of fame. I hate to have to say this, but I think it was largely the American concert and recital industry which had him irredeemably typecast as a performing artist and as the composer of a handful of trifles. The marketable value of any work of art is a very unpredictable thing. The handful of Grainger's works which became appallingly popular, especially in the 1920s and 30s, very soon became artistic liabilities for the composer. Just as poor Rachmaninoff could never leave the concert platform without playing the prelude, so also Grainger was obliged to hammer out country gardens wherever he went. Perhaps you may say he had no right to complain. It certainly brought him a lot of money over the years, but its popularity obscured the hundreds of other works he wrote, and many of which, perhaps because of this, were never performed in his own lifetime. He did everything he could to demythologize country gardens. For example, here he is introducing it on a Rudy Vallée show of 1936 with an almost contemptuous preamble.
Now, of course, you are to hear country gardens. I arranged this Morris dance originally to be whistled by 2 whistlers with a few instruments accompanying them. That was in 1908. In 1918, when I was in the band of the 15th Coast Artillery Corps, I used to improvise on country gardens at Liberty Loan concerts. Finally, in 1919, I had it published for the piano, and you have been afflicted with it ever since. By the way, the country garden in the English sense is not a flower garden. It is a small vegetable garden. So you may think of turnips, if you like, as I play.
We can all rattle off the titles of a dozen or more Grainger compositions. How many of us can list 100 or 200? I haven't even seen his entire output by any means, let alone heard it. Some, I'm sure, were never heard by Percy. I'm pretty sure, for example, that his Jungle Book cycle, choral settings of poems by Rudyard Kipling, which represented the pinnacles of his creative activity from boyhood to old age, which take a mere 19 minutes or so to perform, and which were composed, as he put it, as a protest against civilization, I'm pretty sure these were heard by Grainger only a couple of times, performed as a cycle. When Grainger talked about the joys and sorrows of other people, he was often talking, I think, consciously or otherwise, about his own joys and sorrows. Perhaps we all do this to some extent. But here is Grainger, in a 1957 BBC interview, talking about the reasons for Grieg's bitterness in old age.
He was very disillusioned, and what shall one say, he was a very undignified man. I mean, this is a typical thing. We went up a hill where there was a restaurant up at the top, and Grieg was quite happy. And a German-American came over to speak to him and said in a drunken voice, "We're so proud of you, and we think of you always," and all that. And Grieg said to me, "There, that's it. If I get any praise from anybody, they're always drunk."
Marvelous.
And then another morning he'd be peering down at the earth, and he'd say, "No, I can't understand them. I can't understand the ants. I don't know what they're trying to do."
Why was he disillusioned? I mean, he had fame.
Because his three best works, the folk songs opus 66,
were only played
and
by Percy
the
Grainger.
Lost in the Hills for baritone, two horns and strings, and the symphonic dances,
Yes.
and the album for male chorus opus 30, they were never done in his time in Norway.
Is that piece for two horns, did you say?
Lost in the Hills, literally taken by the hills. They believe that the hills opened up and closed on people. And it begins. That was done in Copenhagen when Grieg was a young man.
Grieg really felt very bitter that these pieces weren't played.
He felt very bitter about everything.
Did he?
Well, I don't mean bitter in a bad sense, but he felt very pained about everything. But of course that's true of all Norwegian poetry. It's one long
Moan.
the hero's moan, not a weakling's moan, but the sadness of a hero.
Now, you don't need a master's degree in psychology to see that Grainger there was also talking about his own bitterness and disillusionment. As early as 1925, we find him writing, "Of course, as we cross 40 and see the futility of many of our hopes and get tired of trying to light the fire in the public that will not burn for us, we also get tired of driving ourselves and others." In 1936 he wrote, "I run around like a headless chicken. It's like kicking out into thin air while the world around me is dying of good taste." He was often writing about his constantly frustrated ambitions to free American, Australian and European music from the plague of absurdities, falsenesses, ignorance and good-for-nothingnesses. And once in a venomous mood he wrote to a friend again in 1936, "There is no recognition for talent and genius. It is no good fighting for it. It will never come. Far better to turn round and attack the world in bitterness, fury and pride, as I hope to do." When he built his museum in Melbourne in the late 1930s, he filled one corridor with a display of first editions of his published compositions, and if, at the time, the public had been allowed inside what was then this tomb-like and locked establishment, they would have also read an explanatory note which ends as follows: "I do not mind being found wanting as long as I am weighed in the balance first, but I, in common with most composers, do not like to be condemned unheard, and the non-performance of my serious compositions is the more insulting in view of the fact that several of my pieces are said to be, quote, known wherever music is made," unquote. This long display of the first editions of my published compositions may seem, to the thoughtless, a proof of my success as a composer. In reality, it marks the measure of my artistic defeat. The bulk of these works are not alive, for music that is not heard is not alive, and the bulk of my music is never heard. Where musical progress and compositional experiments are discussed, my name is never mentioned. Can a more complete aesthetic failure be imagined? Not by me. Percy Grainger, I believe, was a man of vision, a man whose contributions to the lot of human happiness has hardly been tapped, a man who in an age of conformity spent most of his life swimming upstream, not especially for fun, but more so out of a sense of duty to avoid the ocean of mediocrity, and a man whose life and work will continue to fascinate and perplex, partly because he regarded inconsistency as a human and not a wholly ignoble condition, even amidst appalling infirmities of old age, when record companies had cast him aside like a worn-out child's plaything in favour of a generation of largely pianistic typists. Grainger still had a belly full of fire and a soul full of poetry.